Of the many things that can be said in praise of John Percy and the life he led, I want to concentrate on just a few, on some qualities that show him to have been the antithesis of bourgeois stereotypes of revolutionaries. I first met John, and of course Jim as well, in December 1969, along with Bob Gould and other anti-war activists in the Resistance Bookshop and Movement Center in Goulburn Street, Sydney, from where they had been vigorously helping to organize the 15 December 1969 Vietnam moratorium demonstration. I didn't have much idea of what to expect in Sydney. Barry Shepard from the US SWP had visited briefly in the previous August, making contact with a still very loosely organized group of Trotskyists. But I don't recall that he provided me with many details before my departure, aside from a perhaps distorted account of being met at the airport by Australian comrades who looked at him in surprise and said something to the effect of, "You look just like a real person." At that time, John had already been a convinced revolutionary for more than 4 years. His university studies had long been forced to take a back seat to Marxist politics. He, Jim, and a few others intervened to create a radical anti-imperialist wing of the anti-war movement, not only for its own sake, but also as a way of finding and convincing others of the need for a revolutionary party. It was an outlook, a deeply ingrained belief in which he never wavered. Hearing that, someone who didn't know John and didn't know much about revolutionary politics might be inclined to accept the capitalist caricature of Marxists and say, "Stuck in his ways, never changed his ideas." That attitude is reflected in the former revolutionaries who give up, of whom there are too many. In the 1960s, it was easy to underestimate the resilience of capitalism, the resources it could call on to defend itself. As the radicalization waned in the 70s and 80s, a lot of 60s would-be revolutionaries decided that maybe revolution wasn't for them after all. But very few of them said, "It's just too hard. It's too long a haul. Capitalism sucks more than ever, but you've beaten me. I surrender." Nearly always it's been, "Now, suddenly I realize I've learned that revolution is impossible, or that it would be worse than capitalism." John was not a quitter, no matter what the difficulties or disappointments. And I think that one of the main reasons he could maintain an unwavering revolutionary outlook for half a century was that he never stopped learning. His learning was real learning, not discovering excuses for giving up. I've recently been browsing through the first volume of John's History of the DSP and Resistance and reading through the unfinished second volume. What stands out in both volumes is John's attitude that political experiences are valued not only according to how they shape the world, but also as educational opportunities. Repeatedly he makes the point, "From these events we learned, this experience taught us," whether a party intervention had been a success or a failure, or more likely containing elements of each, it was something from which he and hopefully the whole party could learn, so that our next activity would be conducted on the basis of greater knowledge and understanding. And of course, that's why writing his history of the DSP and resistance was so important to John. History for him was much more than what happened in the past. It was something that was still with us. He saw history, if I can put it that way, as thoroughly dialectical, as the basis of the present, and something that, if properly understood, we can use to modify the future. That's why he considered learning their history and incorporating it into their understanding as so important for revolutionaries. The accidents of political assignments and personal choices meant that there were some long periods when I had very little direct contact with John. In 1974, he came to New York to work for 18 months in the fourth international magazine, Intercontinental Press, where I had been working for several years. But this was just at the time when Helen and I were tying up loose ends in New York in order to come to Australia. John and I overlapped at Intercontinental Press for only a few weeks. In the 1980s, while John was taking a central role in the Melbourne branch, I was in Sydney. and since 2000 I've been living overseas. So aside from the late 70s and the 90s, in a few weeks in 2010, when John and Eva visited us in Cambodia and we traveled with them in Laos and Vietnam, there wasn't a lot of time in which to develop a personal friendship. Nevertheless, like many present and former members of organizations John belonged to, I have long regarded him as a friend as well as a comrade. I want to say something about this because there can be confusions about friendships in politics. A superficial view of the sort produced by the crass or capitalist media would have you believe that revolutionaries aren't supposed to have friends. They're only supposed to manipulate each other into serving the interests of Moscow or Beijing or the enemy of the day. But in the revolutionary movement, especially in the Trotskyist tradition, there are also warnings about the danger of confusing friendship and politics. The history of the Fourth International and the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party that we studied contain more than enough examples of cliquism, of party members who voted for this or that candidate for a position because of friendship, rather than the belief that he or she was the best person for the job, or who worked out political positions in a circle of party members who happened to be friends, rather than in the whole party. Sometimes there are revolutionaries who think the best way to avoid these dangers is not to have friends. John certainly didn't make that mistake. He was a very warm person who befriended many people. But anyone who had the illusion that friendship would cause John to modify his views of how best to build a party was quickly disabused of that notion. Conversely, John was not one to let internal party disagreements hamper personal relations. Having had occasional disagreements with him over the years, I know that from personal experience. There's just one more aspect of John I want to mention that contradicts the bourgeois caricature of revolutionaries. This is a stereotype of the tin pot dictator, the head of a small organization who controls everything and demands to be obeyed in everything. As we know, the international socialist movement has produced some real examples of that sort of distorted so-called leadership. John never expected anyone to accept anything he said simply because he said it. He never saw other party members who displayed a talent in a particular area as a competitor. I can remember when I came on the staff of Direct Action in the late 1970s, when John was the editor and justly admired in the party for what he had done with the paper. In many parties, not to mention bourgeois publications, my background would have made the editor perceive me as a threat, not John. As soon as he saw that I could manage the job, he proposed that I replace him as editor so that the party could use him in some other area. For John, there was no prestige or honor inherent in any role. What was prestigious and honorable was being a revolutionary party builder in any position. Over the years, there has been discussion in the world Marxist movement about how human nature might change in a socialist society, and about how much Marxist consciousness can modify our behavior while we are still a long way from world socialism. Che Guevara and other Cuban Marxists raised this concept as socialist emulation, the idea of competition, not to accumulate money, but to do more for social welfare. In my own mind, I have usually envisioned this as workplaces competing to win public recognition for better efficiency. But I have to admit that that's a very limited vision. I now think that emulation in socialist society will be much more like John's approach to emulation in party building. I am sure John was proud of the fact when he led a branch in selling the revolutionary press. But I think he was even happier on those rare occasions when another comrade surpassed his sales. No, John was not a secular saint, but he was a damned good Marxist.